Christmas blessings to all of you, and much love. I'm afraid if you're watching this, I've come down with COVID again and am not able to be with you in person. Nevertheless, I thought I would share this Christmas message with you, and this year what stood out for me is two things really. The first is that God says to all of the players in the drama of the Nativity, do not be afraid. And the second thing is that God then proceeds to completely upend and overturn their whole world. Do not be afraid. I'm just about to throw everything into absolute chaos and change all the things you thought you knew. And those two things actually aren't separate. They're together. If we start with Zechariah, for example, Zechariah, a faithful priest, a member of the house of Levi, who's lived a righteous life, who's loved his wife Elizabeth, but they've not been blessed with a child, and it's a deep sorrow to them both. And he's serving God in the temple, and there he's standing at the altar when suddenly an angel appears to him and says, do not be afraid. And then proceeds to tell Zechariah that he will have a son. Not only a son, but a son who will be a prophet and a legend and the herald of the Messiah. And as you can imagine, Zechariah is somewhat sceptical. So the angel strikes him dumb. He's not able to speak a word until that promise is fulfilled. And Zechariah goes from being a person who is probably quite eloquent and definitely a man of status and some position to suddenly being inarticulate and helpless. And yet in that new state, he finds more joy and connects with God more deeply than he did when his life was all well put together. We pan the camera across to Nazareth and to Mary, a young girl pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, when an angel appears to her and says, do not be afraid. God's chosen you in order that you might be the mother of the one who will save his people. And Mary says, well, how can this be? I'm not married yet. And the angel tells her that the child will not only be the one who saves God's people, but will be God himself in her. Wow. Do not be afraid. I'm about to overturn everything you thought you knew about yourself and God as well. And Mary, in astonishing humility and courage, looks at everything stacked against her, looks at everything she's going to face, looks at the fact that according to the holy law of God, she's about to break all the rules, and yet it's God himself who's asking her to do it. Looks at the censure that she's likely to face from her community, the opposition, the ruin of her marriage and the future and all the dreams that she had for herself. And then she looks at the angel and she says yes. And then we have Joseph. And everything that made him a great prospect for a husband now makes him a terrible risk to Mary, because as a righteous man under the Jewish law, he ought to have her put to death. But being a kind man, he's decided that he'll just simply put her aside quietly when the rumours start and he realises it's true, and she is in fact pregnant, and he knows that he's not the father. But then an angel comes to him in a dream and says, guess what? Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife. And then the story is told to Joseph. And Joseph makes the same courageous choice, that he will take Mary, that he will stand by her, that he will face with her the storm of scandal and ridicule. We pan the camera back to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, who is 6 months along. Mary knows this. Mary travels to be with Elizabeth because perhaps she feels they might find some common ground, both having had their lives completely overturned by the word of God. And Elizabeth has a choice. As a righteous woman of some standing in the community, as the wife of a priest, should she open her home to this young woman who, to all intents and purposes, is pregnant outside of marriage and nobody knows who the father is? And Elizabeth finds her courage, finds her own yes, finds her own way of not being afraid, and welcomes Mary into her home and into her arms. And the child in Elizabeth's womb leaps for joy. And Elizabeth acknowledges that God is at work in Mary's life as well as her own. Two women whose whole notion of holiness has been utterly reshaped and transformed. And then just as Elizabeth has given birth, as Mary and Joseph are preparing for the birth of Jesus, as they've perhaps got their house in order, gathered around a few friends who are willing to still be loyal, as Joseph has perhaps constructed a crib for the baby and Mary and her friends have perhaps made clothes, suddenly everything is upended again. God hasn't finished causing chaos in their lives. The Roman emperor issues a decree and suddenly everybody's on the move. And Joseph and Mary have to face Joseph's family, the house and the line of David based in Bethlehem, and all having gone home. And there is no room for them to stay. And I do wonder, whether the Gospels gloss over this part perhaps, and in fact the reason there is no room is because Joseph has slipped significantly down the pecking order of his family, what with Mary's status and all. And so instead of a handcrafted crib, Jesus is laid in a rough manger, and Mary beds down in the straw. And Joseph's pride as a provider for his family, I suspect, suffers a bit of a setback. Nevertheless, they are warm and they are safe, even in those humble surroundings. And then look at the shepherds, tending their flocks on the hillside, separated from their community, sleeping rough, bit dirty, bit smelly, risking their lives to protect the sheep. And perhaps some of those sheep were destined for sacrifice in the temple, and if they were, then they would certainly need to be kept unharmed and unblemished. And it's the shepherd's role, and in fact their whole economic well-being depends on their ability to keep these sheep alive. And so it's counterintuitive for them to suddenly start plunging down the hillside into Bethlehem, chasing a story. And yet when the angels appear to them in the sky, and the glory of the Lord shines around them, they hear that message, do not be afraid. It's good news. It's good news. Go and find out. Go and see. And they choose not to be afraid, and they choose to go. And they choose to find the baby in a stable. Interesting little bit of forethought on God's part, to make the venue unthreatening for shepherds. And so they go and they find the child and they worship, and their lives are transformed. And what about the angels? We never think about them, do we? And their part in the story. I wonder how it felt for them to go from adoring God in all his might and majesty and glory on his glorious throne in heaven, to suddenly winging their way and shrinking and cramping down into a tiny pinprick of a world, into a tiny little bit of sky over an even tinier place called Bethlehem, in order that they might sing for a bunch of grubby humans. And then to realise that the God they worship and adore has dwindled down to this tiny, sticky, helpless blob of humanity in a manger in a stable in Bethlehem on this little planet. And I wonder, we don't have this part in the Gospels, of course, but maybe it's recorded in the annals of heaven. I wonder whether God had to say his own "fear not" to the angels also. Don't be afraid. I know what I'm doing. Because the thing that stood out to me most as I reflected on the fear nots in the Bible, there's one for every day of the year, including leap years. So many times God needs to tell us not to be afraid because fear is a real part of the human condition. And yet, what caught me most of all about this story is that God does not ask of human beings anything God is not willing to do first. Before God upends the lives of Zechariah and Elizabeth and Mary and Joseph and the shepherds and the angels and later on the wise men, before all of that, God upends and upturns and throws into chaos his own life and his own being. God pours himself out in love and risk. God decides to come and be as vulnerable as it's possible to be. The Lord Almighty, helpless, the Word, wordless, the Maker, part of his creation, the playwright a mere actor in the play. God chooses to become one of us, Emmanuel, not saving us from a position of power and might, but saving us from a position of vulnerability and risk. And the Bible expresses this so beautifully in the words that we hear this Christmas time. Words like, for example, the beginning of John's Gospel. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And as St. Paul writes to the Philippians, though he was in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Do not be afraid, says God, and then overturns everything we thought we knew. Do not be afraid, says God, and then transforms the very ground under our feet. Do not be afraid, says God, and then hurls us headlong into chaos. But amid that chaos, there dwells the peace of Christ. My peace I leave with you, Jesus says. I do not give as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. Do not be afraid. Fear not. Look at the story that happened when a bunch of ordinary people chose not to fear, chose faith instead of fear. Now, it didn't mean that they didn't feel nervous, that they didn't feel terrified, that they didn't feel the extent of the risk they were taking. But they took it anyway. Fear not is not about positive thinking, mind over matter, not allowing yourself to think about the stuff that makes you terrified. It means choosing to do those things anyway. Choosing to trust God more than the voice of our fear. Choosing to listen to the voice of God and the calling of God instead of the voice and the calling of our fear. Fear not, God says. This is planned chaos. This is necessary upending. This is what's needful for life and hope and joy and peace and love. This is a breaking that is a mending. This is a transformation. And you will be different at the other end of it. You will come out changed. But that change will be good news. And I pray for you all this Christmas, whether you've experienced a period of change and turmoil and loss, or whether you fear that you will. Whatever is going on in your life at the moment, I pray that you may hold those words in your heart. Fear not. Do not be afraid, for God is love and God is with us, Emmanuel. And that's the true hope and the true peace that Christmas brings us. May your Christmas be blessed, and may your new year be filled with risk of the right kind, adventure of the right kind, and trust in the God who holds out his hand to lead you into the future. Amen.